Hello, and thank you everyone for joining this week's webinar on Metasearch and the impact of rate parity on your Metasearch campaigns. My name is Dean Schmidt. I'm the Sales Operations Manager here at Derbysoft, and I'll be taking you through the webinar today. This is the third installment of our free webinar series. So far within this, we've covered a number of different topics, including Metasearch in general, what it is, what it does, and why it matters. Last week we talked about the pros and cons of assisted booking measures. Today we'll talk about the roles of rate parity, some seen and unseen, and then culminating all of this next week with budgeting for Metasearch. For those who have been following along in our Metasearch webinar series, you may have noticed that we reversed numbers 3 and 4 here. We actually had the budgeting one being first in our previous predictions, if you will. We've changed these around because they do culminate and really wrap themselves together when we start talking about the budgeting, which we'll cover more extensively next week. But for today, talking about the roles of rate parity in Metasearch in today's webinar, and talking about the impact that they have, the impact on consumer perception, the impact on positioning, the impact on your cost per click, and the impact on your return on ad spend. Now, before we even get into that, I wanted to pause and talk just a little bit about the direct booking movement that we really see in the hospitality industry right now. This is really a hot item. We see a lot of the big brands out there taking a lot of measures to drive bookings directly to their own websites, and with a lot of good reasons. And I don't need to recap those. I'm sure you're familiar with them. But just in, this morning, I saw this article that I actually pulled. I give credit to where it's due here, Fortune.com. Travelers are embracing human travel agents again, published just today. Last month, travel marketing firm MMGY Global released its annual Portrait of American Traveler survey, finding that 32% of travelers now visit direct provider websites when making reservations, and that is up 6% from 2015. Now, to be fair, for every statistic that I see like this, I can probably find you another article out there that will say OTAs are gaining share and so on. So everybody has just a little bit of a different view depending upon the perspective. What I can tell you, however, is that we do see a lot of the big brands out there working to shift that market traffic from the OTAs to brand direct. And Hilton, in fact, specifically saw where in the summer of 2015, they were able to gain more ground, especially on the Metasearch channels, than OTAs in terms of their click share traffic. So it is possible, it is being done, it does take work to do it, and that's what we're here to talk about. Now, when we talk about direct bookings, of course, there's another side to that equation, and this slide comes from an Expedia presentation where they talked about the hotel owner revenue loss due to public loyalty rates and their perception on this. So first of all, they start off with talking about your RevPAR pre-loyalty rates, showing how that reduces slightly with the loyalty rate discount, granting you that, okay, you have a little bit of brand.com price elasticity, so going up on that measure, your reduction in OTA bookings, followed by your reduction in what they refer to as the billboard effect, and there's a lot of arguments for and against that. Little plus on recaptured OTA bookings and savings of OTA compensation. Now they're subtracting again the member discount on recaptured bookings. Well, I think they already accounted for that in the first step, the loyalty rate discount. Maybe, maybe not, but then also see the loyalty member cost. But in their perception overall, loyalty rates costing the hotels actually 8% revenue par, or pre versus post. Now, if we look down at the very bottom of this in the fine print, they do indicate that data is illustrative only and not reflective of actual results or accounts. So that's important to note. This is very opinionated, but it is a valid point. We see cases where on the OTA sites, you have the major brands that are being shaded, not as presented as prominently, and so on. That does present some opportunity for independent hotels and smaller brands out there. And so it does have an impact. But still, when you can get that traffic direct to your website, that has a strong advantage, and we'll talk about that. Now, having said that, I'm going to come out and say that when we talk about rate parity, that loyalty rates do not equate to rate parity. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me show you some examples. First of all, what do we really call rate parity today, and how does it fit into the overall equation of Metasearch? First of all, there are 3 components of a successful Metasearch campaign. The first of them is that rate parity that we're talking about today. Second one is having conversion on your website. We talked about that last week during our pros and cons of assisted booking, and also keeping those costs per clicks low, because obviously you can't pay $30 a click if your hotel room rate is only $75. That math just doesn't work. So when we talk about rate parity specifically, and we look at examples of this one's taken from an international hotel. I didn't want to offend anybody in North America by using their hotel as an example, but we look at this and we can see that the rates are all over the place. We have anything from $91 on Agoda to $101 on Kayak to $111 on the brand direct. So very hit and miss. And as a consumer, I look at this and go, oh my goodness, this is all over the place. Which one of these should I actually click on? Am I getting a good room if I book that one on Priceline, or am I going to get shoved in a closet somewhere? How does that work out? My consumer confidence isn't very good here, and I'm just looking at this and saying that's very poorly managed. I don't know if I even want to book this hotel necessarily. Now, by way of comparison, we'll look at the Grand Hyatt New York, and we can see that their rates are very consistent. I've got $242 on Expedia, on Hotels.com, on Priceline, on TripAdvisor. There's this one site here, Prestigia, that has a higher rate. That's probably their fault more so than Hyatt's fault, but everything is very consistent across the board. Everybody having the same rate. Okay, as a consumer, I can look at this and say, yep, they are on target, spot on across the board. Everything's consistent. I know I'm probably getting the best rate, and I feel safe in booking this hotel. Okay, that's great. So now we have a little bit of consumer confidence in there, but let's take this one step further and look at this example from an independent hotel, the Pelican Inn and Suites. So here we've got good rate parity for the most part. We see Booking.com and Kayak at $249. We see some $289 out there. But then we have the Hotel Direct coming in at $239. Now, not only do I see, okay, they've got pretty good rate parity for the most part, but in fact, my Hotel Direct booking option presents me with the lowest rate. So now not only does that give me consumer confidence, but that's also a call to action, because now as a consumer, where I prefer to book on a brand direct if I can, I have the confidence to say that not only am I getting a good deal, but I'm getting on the hotel's website and I can see that comparison across all the other chains. That is a call to action, not just in terms of the rate, but you look at how it's presented on the site here. Technically, there are as many as 4 different places that I can click on to book that, including right behind that orange button if I just click there. We'll talk more about that here in the next slide. So why do I bring this up, though, in terms of consumer perception? When we talk about rate parity, being equal to isn't necessarily good enough anymore. Getting a deal is more important to the consumers. They're looking for that value. What is this compared to everything else? If I am just the same as everybody else, well, that's not getting a deal. Yeah, that's good. I'm not getting ripped off anyway, but I'm not getting a deal. I want to feel like I'm getting a value and getting something. And Metasearch makes that very transparent to the consumers. They can very quickly and easily come in here and see exactly how you stack up. Now, why I say that loyalty rates are not the premier example of this is because saying that I have rate parity or even a lower rate based on my loyalty rates is kind of like the equivalent of saying, well, I've got a lower rate because we offer the AAA rate, or I have a government discount, or I have an IBM corporate rate that we negotiated. All of those are qualified rates. It's not a rate that is necessarily offered upfront and openly to the consumer that is shopping on these different channels. Whereby if you can just come out and say, you know what, my brand direct rate is going to be $10 lower than Booking.com or anybody else you want to put in that place, you can see how that can very quickly drive traffic. Now, I know that that's easier said than done. There are certainly challenges in doing that. Rate parity clauses come into mind, discussions with the OTAs and how they feel about that come into mind. Yes, I know that it's easier said than done. So there's more to it than just saying, yep, I'm going to offer discounted rates. But if you do that and can do that, it can be a very effective strategy towards your Metasearch campaigns. So now we've talked about it in terms of that consumer perception. Now let's talk about it in terms of how it impacts your position, starting with that same example right there. So as I alluded to earlier, in this scenario, we actually have 4 different points of sale going to this individual hotel. You see one in the very top right-hand corner where it has the strike-through rate of 289 and showing that the Pelican Inn is at 239. I could click there. I could click that orange button and go directly to it. I could click on the top listing under the orange button and go to it. Also, when I go down, this is on Kayak, by the way, and I go on Kayak and they extend my rates, I have that additional listing you see down below, starting with the hotel website. So and you could potentially even have a fifth one, many times I'll list it in the center there, that many different point of sale options on this one website here on Kayak. Kayak does give rate parity and that lowest rate preferential treatment when we talk about positioning on the site. That's very important because that can get you to the top of that list at a lower cost per click, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. So that's the Kayak example. Let's look at another example here. This is inserting a Google hotel ad for the Hilton or Point Hilton Squaw Peak Resort. And if we look down below at the bottom here, we've got Hilton coming in at $103, GetRoom.com at $103. On par with the rate parity. Perfect example. We'll talk here in just a little bit about Google's price bucket structure and how that impacts positioning, because that again is very important as Google also looks at that rate parity to determine who gets that #1 spot. I'm going to talk about that more when we get into discussing the CPC value that goes along with this. By the way, $103 rate, great rate for that hotel. Let's look at Trivago. Omni Bedford Springs Resort on Trivago. And again, up on top here, Trivago likes to prominently display the brand.com websites. We saw that in some of our previous webinars. But in this particular case, they have the lowest rate, so they get prominent positioning, a very prominent listing under the View Deal button, and again, top spot down here below. So all these examples getting that prime positioning, and let's look at TripAdvisor here as well, with the Milner Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, again, having the lowest rate and coming up on top. Now, that is something new for TripAdvisor. TripAdvisor over the past year or so has been notorious as being the site where you could buy your way to the top of the list. Many times you'd see the hotels.com, booking.com, and so on, and those OTA sites coming up higher even though they did not have the lowest rate. TripAdvisor is now taking on a new strategy with that, where they are openly saying, yes, we're going to put that lowest rate on top. Why do they do this? Well, the logic is really very simple. All of these sites get paid when a consumer clicks on that ad. It's like CPC model, right? So they want the consumer to click. What is the consumer going to click on most likely? Really two favorite points as a consumer. A, if I can click on the brand direct, I like that. And B, the one that's got the lowest rate. And if you can put both of those in the same place, that's even better. So they are now putting that up there. So let's now talk about how that impacts your cost per click. And let's look at it by some of the different channels, starting here with Kayak. Kayak has a hybrid of programs that they employ. One is they call their core program, which is the starting point. Usually has a negotiated CPC, a flat rate around $1.50, $1.60, maybe a little more, a little less, but it's a flat CPC. And then they have their Bob program where you can bid for better placement on the Kayak site. Now, if you're able to do something like this with the Pelican Inn and Suites where they're coming in at a significantly lower rate than every OTA and every other provider on there, you can actually get that #1 spot not only in that best position, but at the core CPC. So now imagine you're getting #1 spot for just $1.50 or $1.60 per click. By way of comparison, also imagine that you're one of these hotels. Let's say that you are Orbit's down here at $289, not the lowest rate, and now you're getting the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spot, and probably paying close to $2.50 per click for that. Which one of these is a very better value proposition? Very clear to see. So not only do you get better position, it costs you less, but if you didn't have that rate parity, you'd be getting lower position and paying more for it. Google is no different. So I alluded to this earlier talking about Google price buckets. And very simply, they start off by asking the question, is your room rate one of the cheapest? If the answer is yes, you are added into price bucket 0, and now you are bidding against everybody else in a price bucket 0. Imagine if you were the only one in price bucket 0. You'd be bidding against yourself. Now, yes, Google does have some minimums that have to be taken into consideration, but as long as you're above that minimum, you may not have to compete against other hotels for CPC, depending upon what other buckets they fall into. So if they're $1 off, $3 off, they might also be in that same bucket with you. But if you're significantly lower, enough so that everybody else gets moved into price bucket 1, which they call competitive, now all of a sudden you're just bidding against yourself and you just have to meet the minimums. So that's an easy way to get that better positioning on Google at a lower CPC. Now, having said that, in contrast to what we see TripAdvisor doing right now, where they are really moving to rate parity, being one of the key deciding factors in their positioning, on Google, we are seeing some recent trends where they are allowing some OTAs, namely Booking.com, to actually buy their way into those top positions. Now, we have learned this has a very high cost per click. And to be truthful, that's not sustainable and will not be a long-term strategy. But it does seem to be the OTA countermeasure to the recent Book Direct initiatives because they want to be able to get that positioning. Booking.com in particular, we've seen being very aggressive on all the OTA sites. You know that they have, of course, on the TripAdvisor, the instant book. Oftentimes when we see TripAdvisor showing up on Google hotel ads, it ends up coming back to their instant book through Booking.com. Same thing with Kayak. So Booking.com is being very aggressive in this space. They really want to own the position. These CPCs, to get that spot when you have a higher rate, in some cases, not in this example with Flamingo, but in some cases, we've seen them be as high as even $50 cost per click. Great for branding. If you want to have that positioning and you want to be there, have that exposure, and have your name in lights all the time, you could do that. A good way to have a positive return? Yeah, not necessarily. So you can see in the example here, Flamingo Las Vegas at $69 has a better chance of getting up there into that position at the lower rate. And so that's very important there as well. So there's exceptions to every rule, and these are, of course, changing every day, which is why it's important to work with a company that's on top of these and abreast of all these changes and can help you manage and manipulate your campaigns accordingly. Okay, so how does this impact our return on ad spend? Well, earlier in the presentation, we talked about the key factors for a successful Metasearch campaign. Number one on that list is rate parity. All right, check that off the map. We talked about how rate parity can get you that higher position and in turn also get you a lower cost per click. All right, check that one off on that. We left out conversions here. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But first, when we talk about numbers 1 and 3, rate parity and low CPCs, there's some added value to these. One of these being the fact that it gives you better positioning, equals more visibility, equals more traffic. So now you're getting more volume off of that. But the second part of this is now you're increasing that consumer confidence, which in turn equals higher conversion rates, and that means that we can check off number 2. But all of this started with rate parity. So we see how that trickles down and has that effect on all of the other facets that are necessary to drive a successful Metasearch campaign. And again, rate parity starts with being equal to the lowest rate, as we saw in some of the earlier examples. But it can go a step further and can be very successful when you, in fact, not just have equal to, but in fact, lower than those rates. And what you can end up doing is having a very low CPC, getting a very high return, and it can be a very successful Metasearch campaign for you. That concludes our presentation for today. Once again, I want to thank everybody for your time. If you are watching this as a replay on the Webinar Jam link, you will notice that there is a comment section in there, and we welcome you to type any questions in there that you may have. Those will be forwarded to us by email, and we'll be happy to respond to those in a timely fashion. Coming up next week, we have our final installment of our 4-part webinar series, which will be budgeting for Metasearch. This is a very important one as it recaps all of the things we've learned so far through the first 3 webinars and then wraps that up and talks about how to use that information to plan for 2017 and how you are budgeting for that. May have some surprises in there for you. It may not be exactly what you think. So we invite you to tune into that. We would love to have you here. And thank you for your time today. Again, my name is Dean Schmidt with Derbysoft. Take care.